Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on COP29, a litmus test for global climate action. My name is Diarmuid Torney, and I'm Director of the Centre for Climate and Society here in Dublin City University and an Associate Professor in DCU School of Law and Government. And this webinar has become an annual tradition in the activities of the Centre. The DCU Centre for Climate and Society is Ireland's first academic centre devoted to promoting perspectives on climate change from the social sciences and humanities. We examine in our work how different societal arenas such as politics, media, education, and business can influence climate action. In little under 2 weeks, representatives of the world's governments will gather in Baku, Azerbaijan, for this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP29. After a year of further climate extremes across the world, one might hope that the attention of world leaders would be firmly fixed on the climate crisis. But COP29 is taking place against the backdrop of harrowing conflict and deep geopolitical uncertainty, with ongoing wars in Gaza, Lebanon, and Ukraine, to name just three, providing a very turbulent context for global cooperation on climate change. Key issues on this year's COP agenda include agreeing a new global climate finance goal, setting expectations for the updating of national climate commitments, funding the new loss and damage mechanism, and operationalizing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on carbon markets. To discuss these and other key issues facing COP29 and to set the scene for us, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts: Sinead Walsh, John Sweeney, Caroline O'Doherty, and Lucy Gaffney. I will introduce each of them properly in just a minute, but to begin with, some housekeeping. The webinar will last for approximately 1 hour and will run roughly as follows. I will introduce each of our speakers in turn and ask them an opening question. After that, we will move into a discussion amongst the panel members. And during the final 20 minutes or so, we will take questions from you, the audience. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to pose questions to our panelists. And so to our opening contributions. I'm going to start off with Dr. Sinead Walsh, who has been Climate Director at Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs since 2020. Prior to this, she served as the EU Ambassador to South Sudan and Irish Ambassador to Sierra Leone and Liberia. Before joining the Irish government, Sinead spent 10 years in the NGO sector, predominantly working with Concern Worldwide, working in India, Pakistan, Rwanda, and South Sudan, as well as in a global advocacy role. Sinead, COP29 is being called the Finance COP, as a new global climate finance goal will need to be agreed. With the previous pledge of $100 billion a year made by rich polluting nations to support less well-off nations mitigate and act climate change was achieved 2 years later than agreed. Today, estimates of what is required are as high as $500 billion to over $1 trillion per year. How hopeful are you that a new pledge that meets the growing needs will be agreed to, and what are the key sticking points? And can you also tell us a bit about priority topics that Ireland will be focusing on at COP29?
Thanks, Diarmuid, and yeah, good to be here again for our annual COP29 seminar. This is going to be a tough one. I think at this webinar every year we say that, but I think everybody can understand that when the main topic of the COP is finance, it's going to be particularly tough. And really, that's what the COP in Baku is all about. The main item really is the agreement of this new collective, what we call the new collective quantified goal, a very difficult acronym, NCQG, that you'll hear thrown around. And to be honest with you, how hopeful am I? I mean, I think this will go down to the last hours. I wouldn't be surprised if the negotiations run late because of this topic. we have made quite limited progress, I would say. I mean, people watching probably know that usually in the COPs negotiations, there's negotiation all year round at technical level. There's the mid-year negotiations in Bonn in June. And really, we haven't seen very much progress on this particular topic. But I don't really think that's surprising, because I think it's gonna need to be raised to the political level. And I would say it'll go down to the last hours. And really what it boils down to is this question of, you mentioned it already, that the how much should the new goal consist of? But also, I think really importantly for us in Ireland and in the EU is this question of the contributor base. So, you talked earlier about the 100 billion being, from sort of rich polluting countries. But actually, at the moment, the list of developed countries that should pay in to climate finance is actually a list from 1992. So we're in 2024, and we're still using this really small list of developed countries and saying that, only these countries have a responsibility to pay climate finance. I'll tell you who's not included. Saudi Arabia is not included, for example. UAE is not included. China is not included. Lots of countries that have, kind of have economic capacity, and also a lot of countries that have made a great deal of money from fossil fuels. So I think what we're saying in the EU is we're not trying to evade our responsibility here. We want to pitch in. We believe we should pitch in, but we also believe that that contributor base needs to be broader in 2024. So I think that's kind of the key issue on the finance. And as I say, I think it's going to go down to the wire. And if people want to talk more about the details of that, I'm very happy to do that, maybe in the Q&A. But I think the other point I would make, and it comes to your second question on what Ireland will focus on, is that for Ireland, we're always looking at the poor countries, the climate vulnerable countries, who are really struggling with adaptation. I mean, we've seen the floods in Valencia over the last 24 hours, but we don't see actually constant floods and storms and so on in a lot of the countries that Ireland focuses on in Africa and Asia, and the island states in particular, Latin America, because they don't get as much coverage in Europe. But there's a lot of countries that are suffering greatly. And for Ireland, we're always very keen to make sure that they're getting supported for adaptation, they're getting supported for loss and damage. So I think a big challenge for Ireland in this COP is, how do we bring that into the finance conversation, which sometimes can be very much about mitigation and transition. And we're in quite a good position, because Minister Eamon Ryan has been appointed. They have these ministerial pairs for each topic, and Minister Ryan is the ministerial pair for a developed country on adaptation, along with Costa Rica. So we think adaptation and that finance conversation are going to really intersect a lot, and we really have an opportunity, given our experience, I think, in Ireland and in Irish Aid working on this stuff, to really put the adaptation case forward. So I think that'll be the big stuff for us. Loss and damage as well. It should be relatively straightforward to formalize the fund getting up and running, but the progress on that is very good. We're on the board of that. And also, maybe the last points I would mention is the Article 6 negotiations on the carbon markets. We really need to get those rules finalized so that we can really make the most of the carbon markets, and that links back to finance as well. And then maybe the last point I'd mention, which isn't getting enough attention, is the gender negotiations, where we really just need to make sure that we hold the line on having gender language, and also looking at the intersection between gender and the finance discussions as well, and making sure that we're mainstreaming gender across the negotiations. So that's the big stuff, I think, for us.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Sinead. And there'll be a chance in the discussion later to pick up on some of those themes. I'll next turn to Professor John Sweeney, who has joined the screen. Hi, John. John is Emeritus Professor in the Geography Department at Maynooth University. John has published very widely on climatology and climate change in Ireland and has served as President of the Irish Meteorological Society, the Geological Society of Ireland, and Antashka. Professor Sweeney has contributed to the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he's also a regular contributor to print and broadcast media on climate change, science, and policy. He is also, it is, I think, fair to say, a COP veteran. John, if I'm not mistaken, I think this might be your 29th COP. You've certainly, you've been to many of them. Anyway, you're certainly a veteran. Having attended so many of them, what reflections do you have on how the COP process has evolved over the years, the importance the global community puts on the outcomes of each COP, and where Ireland might be able to have influence at this year's COP?
Well, thanks very much, Dermot. I haven't, in fact, attended all 29 of them. This is my 15th one, but certainly, yeah, you could classify me as a COP groupie, I suppose, at this stage. Over those 29 COPs that we've experienced, the process has evolved quite significantly. And for me, at least, while every COP is different, and as Sinead was saying, this is going to be a particularly hard one, while every COP is different, there have been some seminal COPs that I think perhaps have left an indelible impression on me. And the first one was the one that I attended first, which was the Copenhagen COP, COP15. And, well, sorry, this was one which, of course, was a bit of a car crash from beginning to end. And I witnessed the failures of the chair and the presidency to get an agreement out of this COP. But more importantly, what I saw at Copenhagen was a fundamental change in the way COP was functioning, because up until that point, COP was very much a top-down, developed country-led process with emission target reductions being laid down for individual countries from the top. And COP15 overturned that completely. In the last day, for example, there were great hopes that the newly elected President Obama would come along and bang heads together. But in fact, what happened was he was snubbed by the Chinese delegation, who wouldn't arrange a meeting with the Chinese negotiator for him. And then secondly, when he lost patience and barged into the Chinese delegation room, he found that there was a group of people, a group of countries, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, who were hatching an alternative outcome for the COP. Now, why this was important and why it marked an end to what had been the previous protocol, if you like, was that this was the emergence of the BRICS countries as the drivers of the COP process. It marked, if you like, the exclusion of Europe, who had kept the flame of climate action alive during the George Bush years. They weren't round the table. It marked largely the exclusion of the United States as well. And so we moved to a very fractious COP arrangement and COP protocol after that, because it took about 6 years for COP to heal the wounds of Copenhagen. And they were only healed, I suppose, gradually in the lead up to Paris COP29. Now, the second thing that I think I got out of the COP process in those years was the importance of personal relationships. In the build-up to Paris, the United States, through its negotiator John Kerry, and China, through its negotiator Xi Jinping, they built a very solid personal relationship, and they trusted each other. And this was if you like, the building bricks of the Paris Agreement, an arrangement that they had agreed in principle in several areas before the meeting itself. And of course, money, and money is the key this year, money lubricated that process, especially for countries like Russia, who had benefited a great deal. But it was a very upbeat, very different atmosphere from Copenhagen. As soon as other people went to Paris, you knew countries were there to do business. And that was the most positive aspect, I think. It was the highlight and maybe the high water mark of the whole COP process over the past 29 years. And it marked also another fundamental change in the way COP processes worked, because here was first of all a switch away from top down to bottom up approaches to pledges from individual countries as to what they could do and could commit to doing, rather than being told what they should do from above. And that has been the basis of the nationally determined contribution system, the pledges that have been so characteristic of the past 10 years at all of the COPs. Now, the other point I think that came out for me post-Paris was that those pledges, those NDCs, they weren't genuine in some cases. They weren't sincere. And countries had developed very skilled ways of framing their pledges so that they didn't really have to do too much to achieve them. So pledges were framed as per capita emissions, or framed as emissions relative to business as usual, or framed as conditional on aid or conditional on political achievements. And all of that enabled get-out clauses, if you like, for countries. And so the Paris commitments were not delivered on. And I noticed in the past few COPs that there have been efforts to try and get new NDCs, which kind of standardize the approach, have the same base year, have the same language for commitments. And even those, the second round, have not been successful at this stage either. So a third round is now underway for Belém next year. And that's a crunch issue as far as I can see for COP to come to terms with. Now, I think it's fair to say that the other thing that we see is that some countries send negotiators with instructions not to give any concessions away at all. And you can understand for some totalitarian countries that for a negotiator to come back and say he gave away the crown jewels or she gave away the crown jewels is not something that is going to be welcomed. So there have been some countries for whom COP as a process, well, the best result is a no-scoring draw, in a sense. So that's comes through with some of the countries and has hindered progress, I think, as well. And then lastly, I think Sinead alluded to the outdated groupings that we have. The Group of 77 in China, for example, containing a China which is very different from what it was in 1992. It's not a developing country in that sense of the word, containing countries like the oil-producing states and the small island states in the same grouping, which have very different agendas for progress. And it's outdated and it's unwieldy, and it's quite clear that this is inhibiting progress on the COP itself. Lastly, then, I suppose you asked what Ireland might be able to have influence on. And I think over the years I've been going, initially Ireland was very much a sort of a country that sheltered behind British intransigence, to put it frankly. Now that has changed post-Brexit, and Ireland is now a voice that's listened to as a bridge country. With our post-colonial history, with our legacy of assistance to developing countries, we are now accepted as a voice of reason within both the EU and the developing world at large. So I think what Sinead was saying is very true, that we have a role that can be played. And even within the EU, Ireland is going to be a very useful counterbalance at those breakfast meetings that are held every morning to adopt a unified approach. Ireland is going to be very useful, especially now that the presidency of the EU is being held by the Hungarians. So I think there's going to be progress possibilities there. And lastly, then, I suppose the other thing that has helped Ireland has been the professionalisation of its negotiators, the professionalisation and the good skills shown by the Department of Foreign Affairs in particular. But the big question, of course, as Sinead alluded to, is the question of whether Ireland and the other countries involved in those loss and damage negotiations can persuade countries such as China and Saudi Arabia to contribute to the loss and damage fund, can persuade or reach agreement as to who should benefit from the loss and damage fund, how to avoid countries that are relatively middle income countries accessing the loss and damage fund as well. And those are where the crucial issues, I think, will come up. And they mark an evolution, of course, in the COP process away from its original intention of simply dishing out limits and forcing countries to comply with emission limits to one where I think we have to accept that Europe is now a small bit player in the international field. We only have 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions in Europe. So we have an influence that's much reduced from 1992 or from Copenhagen, and we have to therefore play a slightly different role in those negotiations. But I'm quite confident that Ireland in particular is well placed, as Sinead said, with skilled negotiators both in the public service and also the ministerial delegation who are quite well placed to knock heads together and are well trusted in the international arena.
Thanks very much for that, John. Sinead's ears will have been burning there when you were love bombing the officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs. That was great to get that kind of longer sweep and hearing about your experience going back to COP21, which was in fact my the first COP I attended. I haven't been to most or even many of them since then. Sorry, COP15 in Copenhagen. I also went to COP21 in Paris. But thanks very much for that, John. We'll come back on some of those points later. I'll turn next to Lucy Gaffney, who is Executive Director of Business for Biodiversity Ireland, a not-for-profit. The organisation helps companies develop credible nature strategies. Lucy has over 15 years of experience launching and leading successful ventures in the fields of microbiology, biotechnology, and sustainability. Lucy currently sits on a range of advisory boards and steering committees, and she is participating in the working group for the Nature Finance Roadmap for Ireland. Lucy, it seems as though every week we are reading about the irrevocable loss of habitat and species in Ireland and across the globe. At the same time, we hear of various businesses rolling back their environmental and climate commitments. As well as the upcoming climate COP16 of the Convention on Biological Diversity is ongoing at the moment in Cali, Colombia. How do you assess progress to date at those negotiations in Colombia at COP16? And do you think that the outcomes that we can expect from COP29 will influence how business thinks about climate and biodiversity?
Thanks, Diarmuid. Yes, I mean, I think the two COPs are completely interlinked. And I think one thing, so COP16 is currently underway in Cali in Colombia. It's not quite finished yet, that they're going to finish up at the end of this week, but there has been a lot of talk about this particular COP, given the fact that it was labelled as this People's COP, that there was going to be a really strong emphasis on the role of Indigenous people when it comes to nature conservation. In 2 years ago in Montreal, we had COP15, so that's the CBD COP15, and that's when we agreed the Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's the GBF, 23 targets that were, assigned and agreed upon by 196 countries. And this is the first time that we are having the opportunity to do a global stock take on what was agreed back in 2022. And essentially, the kind of flagship target that was part of the GBF, a bit like the Paris Agreement, was the 30 by 30 target, which is essentially the protection of 30% of our land and seas and freshwater habitats by 2030. And the stock take that has happened since the beginning of COP16 is showing us that we haven't made a whole lot of progress against that. So 17% of our terrestrial ecosystems are underprotected. status and only 8.4% of our oceans. And a lot of that would have already been in sort of protected status before the agreement of the GBF. So we have a lot of pledges, a lot of promises coming, but it's unmatched by action from those particular countries. We've also asked those signatories to provide updated national biodiversity strategic action plans. Ireland is one of the few countries that has actually done that, one of 21 countries that has actually submitted an updated NBSAP. The key discussions on the table for COP16 focus on Indigenous people, this notion of digital sequence information, which is a fancy term for genetic resources. How do we fairly distribute the benefit of those genetic resources, and conservation policy? But I think what we've noticed is that finance has risen once again to the top of the agenda because it's such a contentious issue, particularly not just in the climate space, but really in the biodiversity space as well. When we think about Indigenous peoples, what we're expecting to see by the end of this week is some kind of agreement that there would be a measure to include Indigenous people in biodiversity decision-making. And so far, we've seen the CBD allowing a permanent presence at the official CBD processes for the Indigenous people's voice. We move to the finance side of things, delivering on funding conservation. We now need billions. And that's, I think, the key thing is when we looked at this 2 years ago, we thought, okay, 700 billion is about what we need up to 2030 to really scale the nature restoration. And 700 billion is roughly what the world spends on soft drinks every year. So just to put a bit of context around that figure, that has now been revised, and we're looking at, target 19 of the GBF looks at mobilizing 200 billion of finance. And we're really seeing very low uptake or very low action in terms of delivering that kind of money. In fact, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, it's only about 200 million right now. So there's been a big shortfall in terms of the delivery of finance towards nature restoration. This is where COP29 and COP16 really do interlink. And what we really need to see is those two summits transforming the finance system. So finance is such a big contentious issue across both of these issues, but I think what we're going to start seeing in the climate COP is more alignment with nature and biodiversity. We've done a very good job of separating the two issues. We all know now that they're completely interlinked. We want to see more alignment with nature coming out of COP29 and a more integrated approach in terms of tackling the issues surrounding these two areas. We need decisive action that will see us cutting financial flows towards nature negative activities. We have a huge amount of money still flowing in that direction. 2.6 trillion globally goes into activities that actively degrade nature. So that is a huge thing that needs looking at, and that is kind of sitting around target 18 of the GBF, which is the existence of environmentally harmful subsidies and the need for the signatories to identify them and reform them over the next few years. So as I said, we have 2.6 trillion worth of government subsidies currently going into nature negative activities. The Global Biodiversity Framework has put a target in there for people to address those. And we're now looking for approximately 500 billion every year to be reformed and moved into nature positive activities, obviously with equity and the just transition in the radar as well. So COP16 is an important moment, I think, to help build momentum around this. Just in terms of business, we now know that the private sector is also pumping a lot of money into nature negative activities in the region of about 5 trillion per year, and it's about 35 times the amount of money that's going into nature restoration. So there's a huge delta, and that needs to be one of the key things that's addressed, not just in COP16, but also in COP29. Another key thing where we're going to see that intersection with the two COPs is the issue of deforestation. So we really need to see action on deforestation. In COP26 in Glasgow, we had the Glasgow Leaders Declaration setting a deforestation target, looking to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, and we are way off on that. We've made barely a dent in our deforestation targets that were set those a few years ago. So we'll hopefully see deforestation rising up the agenda in COP29, as well as ongoing negotiations happening in COP16 in Cali as well. The last thing I'll just talk about quickly is biodiversity credits. We've seen loads of launches of various different high integrity principles for biodiversity credits. It's another contentious issue. We know biodiversity is not fungible. There'll never be a single global credit market for biodiversity credits. And I think we're coming to the realization that that is an issue. Indigenous peoples have pushed back on biodiversity credits and offsets because they are essentially features of a capitalist mindset, not aligned with their own cultures. Big pushback from Indigenous people there, and really a drive to look for compensation frameworks that will address the root problems of nature, which is basically our failure to value nature. In terms of metrics, and there's always discussions around biodiversity metrics there, we're never going to have a single universal metric for biodiversity. We've seen a lot of launches of various different global biodiversity metrics, and we've seen organizations like Plan Vivo and Vera, who we're all familiar with from the carbon markets, launching nature credit methodologies. So, there's quite a lot happening in the finance space. And just to finish off around businesses, many people might be familiar with the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. They had a huge presence in COP16. They have announced that they've almost 500 corporates that have adopted TNFD at this point, and they're also constantly releasing further guidance to help businesses engage with nature and, by extension, more with climate. So they've delivered more guidance on sectoral transition pathways and also access for nature-related data to be made more accessible. So really, we want to see, with the two COPs, we want to see alignment of climate and nature objectives and to start addressing these things in an integrated way.
Great job.
Great, Lucy, thanks very much for setting that out for us. Our final speaker is Caroline O'Doherty, who is Environment Correspondent for the Irish Independent. Now, we've been having some technical challenges, and Caroline is joining on her mobile phone. But we'll come to her in a minute, and hopefully it'll all go smoothly. But first of all, I'll introduce Caroline, who is Environment Correspondent for the Irish Independent and reports on a wide range of environmental topics, from the climate crisis and nature conservation to the built environment, energy, extractive industries, pollution, the policies causing problems, and the people trying to effect change. And prior to joining the Irish Independent in 2019, Caroline had a roving brief nationally and internationally. Before I pose a question to Caroline, just to say, because she's joining on her phone, you won't obviously get to see a video of her. I am going to stay on screen, so you'll have to put up with me on the screen while you listen to Caroline. So Caroline, hopefully you're hearing me loud and clear. You've covered by this stage quite a few COPs. Can you tell us about the key issues you'll be following in Baku this year? I'd also be interested to hear your strategies for covering what can sometimes be seen as a dull technical conference, and what sort of engagement you have from readers of the newspaper during the COP. Caroline, are you hearing me? Okay. We seem to be having some challenges there. Caroline is not unmuting. So apologies everyone for this. We might move into the Q&A at this stage and see if we can get those issues with Caroline's connection solved. So if I could ask the other panelists to turn on their videos so that you will appear on screen, and apologies to Caroline and to everyone else for those challenges. Thanks again, Sinead, John, and Lucy, for your opening contributions there. I'll start off with a simple question around the US presidential election next week. As everyone at this stage will be aware, there is an important and very consequential election in the US next week. So how do you think that the outcome of that election will shape the proceedings at COP29. We don't obviously know the outcome yet, but there is, I think, some precedent for US presidential elections being decided around during or around the time of COP. So who would like to come in on that?
Well, I can come in because we have a precedent in a sense when Mr. Trump was elected for the first time and took the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Now, what we can expect to see this time is probably something similar if he wins the election. But the last time round was quite interesting because there were in effect two United States delegations in Marrakesh after the Paris Agreement. One was a sort of basically a small hut with a note pinned to the door saying, you know, for further information, contact this number. And that was the official Trump delegation. But there was also a large sort of individual states delegation where individual states such as California had decided they were going to go their own way and getting sponsorship. They built their own their own stands and so on. And I think we will see that again. But I think there's a difference this year in that the US is no longer really in a position to lead at the moment because it's getting such negative publicity worldwide over the Gaza case that I think it will be very difficult for the US to adopt a profile which will be convincing to most of the world's countries this year. And that's perhaps going to be more serious in many ways than the absence or the absence of a delegation from a Trump-led presidency. And that's a more long-standing issue because the US is a country that emits 5 times the emissions of the European Union combined. So it is important to try and keep the US on course, and that will be very difficult this year.
Thanks, John. Lucy or Sinead, would either of you like to come in on that question?
It's a contentious one, all right. I mean, I think it's an understatement to say it'll be a massive setback if Trump gets in. I mean, he's already said, I know Biden signed them back up to the Paris Agreement, and then he'll be whipping that rug out from under people's feet again. So, I mean, there's nothing to be said more than let's just pray it doesn't happen, because it'll be a huge setback for the entire world if the US are not at the table. You know, from the climate perspective, I can only imagine, you know, the nature perspective as well. They'll start eating wildlife down in Springfield to fill the gap there. So who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say about this, Diarmuid, except, you know, we should also be careful that we don't sort of characterize it as, you know, Democratic victory, great for climate action, Republican victory, terrible for climate action. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One is what John said, and what was really powerful and what's still really powerful about the mobilization of cities and, you know, like all levels of government as well, all sorts of really interesting things happening with networks of local government and cities and all sorts of subnational bodies. But also because, you know, the US, as John said, is a very big emitter. And I think that under Joe Biden, there's been some really interesting and really important and significant work in the slightly oddly termed Inflation Reduction Act for clean energy. But at the same time, there's still very, very significant fossil fuel production. So I think we should also, you know, try to be careful not to be kind of black and white and just basically say, look, we don't have a choice who wins anybody else's elections other than our own. And, you know, and you know, we're going to have to make the best of who wins in the US and who wins anywhere else, I suppose, and see what strategies there are to, you know, to work nevertheless in either situation.
Thanks, Thanks, Sinead, and thanks everyone for those responses. I'll just a reminder to the audience to add questions in the Q&A. I can see some questions coming in there. I might. So I see there's a question there about the leaders, reports of the leaders of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael indicating that they do not intend to travel to COP29 because of the general election campaign. I might piggyback on that to ask a more general question of how we can manage to keep climate and biodiversity on the political agenda nationally and globally. I referenced in my opening remarks the very challenging global circumstances with conflict and geopolitical tension around the world. Does anyone have any thoughts on how we can get policymakers, leaders domestically and around the world to keep a focus on climate in such challenging and politically charged circumstances?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is there are two instruments available to us, and the first instrument is simply to ask politicians at the door and express our priorities to canvassers, for example, as regards what they are not doing in terms of climate action and in terms of meeting our national domestic legislative requirements. And secondly, of course, there is, we're lucky in that we now have a law, and we can use the legal instruments increasingly to force action from intransigent politicians who are not willing to be leaders on this topic. And that's what we can do at a domestic level. At an international level, we have to work through our EU representatives and our EU Commission to try and ensure that the Green Deal, for example, is not sidelined by populist politicians. So they would be the main instruments, I think. And of course, at the COP, there will be an agreed position by the EU, and it's important that that position is a strong position in terms of the EU priorities for climate action being emphasised in the negotiations at all stages.
Thanks, John. Lucy or Sinead, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I liked, I don't know if people were watching when Barack Obama was rapping the Eminem song at an event, and I suppose the part I remembered from the clip that I watched was not so much that, but he kept saying, when people would boo, he would say, "Don't boo, vote." And I think that's, as John mentioned, I think that's often what it comes down to, is that we need to really keep the pressure on and the support up for bringing climate action into schools and community groups and all that kind of thing. But that's got to be combined with people exercising their franchise in a way that shows that that's what they care about, which unfortunately in a lot of countries at the moment doesn't really seem to be the case. And I think if we look back to 2019, when we got the Green Deal, you can see in the European context that climate was much higher on the priority list for voters in various domestic elections than it is now. So I think we need to put maybe redouble our efforts, but always focused on the need for people to express themselves through voting. And just on John's point, I mean, so we have now published the EU position for COP. It's Googleable. It's the you just need to Google the Council conclusions, and that lays out that position. And of course, that position can and should also evolve as COP progresses. But I think it's a pretty good start.
Thanks, Sinead. Lucy, do you want to come in?
I'll just say something briefly, and the first thing to say, I don't have an answer to that, because I think it's an incredibly difficult challenge that we have, and we've already seen climate and biodiversity kicked to the curb a number of times over the last couple of years. So it's still an issue for the wider population, that it still doesn't feel like it's close enough to home for many people. And perhaps that's a communications problem that we have. I think the role of media, they have a huge role to play in communicating about climate. I think us as individuals have a huge role to play in using our sphere of influence to raise these issues across the dinner table or wherever it's appropriate, and doing it in a way that doesn't make people feel frightened or alienated. So, you know, there's still a lot we can do to keep the conversation going, to keep it alive, but unfortunately, the way the world is, climate gets pushed down the agenda when there's bigger things happening. So again, it's not an answer, more of an observation.
Diarmuid, could I just add one thing to that? Because I think, Lucy, what is easier maybe in my experience to communicate is actually nature rather than climate. And I think that's often where we can sort of you know, help people to see, you know, the direct impacts of our actions is more if we focus on the nature agenda. Sometimes the climate agenda can be a bit abstract and seem a little bit far from people's daily lives. So I think that's just I suppose an observation in terms of strategy, how to make things seem personal.
Great, thanks very much for that. Just to let the audience know, we're still in the background trying to find a way for Caroline to join the call before the end of the hour. So if we can get her online, we will. But in the meantime, I'm just looking through the questions on the chat. There is a question from DCU's Masters in Climate Change class that my colleague Dave Robbins is teaching at the moment, and they have been logged into this webinar along with Dave. And the question is that NDCs are legally binding, but the achievement of those NDCs are not legally binding. What do you think about this? Yeah, so any reflections on that?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about some countries actually expressing aspirations rather than implementation details. But I think, you know, it's an important question because what's at stake at this COP, I think, is a realization that the carbon budget is dwindling so quickly. And that the NDCs are designed to save us from exceeding that 1.5 degree threshold. Now, we have, about 7 years left of the carbon budget, and then we're in uncharted territory in terms of tipping points. So I think, you know, the NDCs need to get real for Belém. They need to be specific, and we need to get countries to commit to doing things, but to correcting their trajectory where they're not delivering on the promises they made. And that's central to the whole COP process at the end of the day, I think.
Thanks, John. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think that I mean, I think it's a great, it's an excellent point. But I think money is the key issue here for me, because countries continuously say we can't achieve our NDCs because we haven't received enough support. I mean, developing countries often say we haven't received enough support from developed countries, and then we go round and round in this in this argument. So I think this is one of the reasons why the NC, and by the way, you know, it is also often very valid, right? There's often, especially the kind of countries that we focus on in you know, with the Irish government support, you know, where these countries have huge challenges of poverty and so on. So, you know, it is difficult to pay. And we also find that, I mean, it comes back to that broader climate finance conversation. The countries that can least afford to invest in the transition are also the countries where the private sector doesn't really think that the transition will be very profitable for them. So, you know, I think this is one of the reasons. It comes back to a point that you made earlier, John, about the loss and damage fund and targeting. But, you know, I think we really need to be targeting our grant support you know, into countries and concessional loans, highly concessional loans, ideally, into countries that really need it, and then try to shift the private sector finance and the kind of, you know, the less concessional loans to countries, and there are many of them, you know, like, you know, sort of China and so on, where, you know, the private sector can already make money, so we really shouldn't have to subsidize this. So part of it is about how we kind of place and how we kind of target the money. But I think, to me, that's why we can't at the moment make the achievement of NDCs legally binding, because, or sort of one of the reasons is because of this financial gap.
Thanks, Sinead. Caroline, can I ask, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you, Diarmuid.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
So sorry.
Great. No, and apologies that this has proved so challenging, but great to hear you. So we are unfortunately quite close to the end, but I wanted to bring you in before we wrap up the discussion. So can I ask you what kinds of issues you'll be following in Baku at COP29 this year, and also your perspective on how, as a journalist, you cover a conference like a COP that, you know, is sometimes seen as dull and technical, and what kinds of engagement you have from your readers.
Look, Diarmuid, the timing of this COP is disastrous. I'm only getting to the first week of this COP because the news cycle is all about the election, and sadly the election is not all about climate. So that speaks for itself in terms of the challenges even of getting attention to this year's COP for media in Ireland. I will be looking at the key issues. I'll be following the money. I'm really curious, not just about the figures that are agreed or not agreed, and not just the sources in terms of the countries who are going to be maybe new contributors to finance pots, but some of those novel ideas that have been floating around and pushed the last couple of years in terms of international taxes, maybe on shipping, maybe levies on airline flights, maybe direct taxes on fossil fuel profits. I'd be interested to see, is there any move on that? I suspect it might not be, but it's the kind of thing that ordinary people get behind, because if fossil fuels are the cause of the problems, you know, let's go after the big polluters that way, and let's get money back from them. I'll be looking at the kind of things that are in and around COP, if you like. So yes, the NDCs, I think that's going to be really interesting to see whether there are any kind of early mover countries, or countries that are shying away from saying, well, February, yeah, we know we might not have our new submission in by then, or we will do, but it's not going to be what you expect. And also fossil fuels. I'll be following the fossil fuels in and around the talks. You know, there will be campaigns and initiatives. BOGA, Beyond Oil and Gas, that Ireland was a co-founder of. It'll be interesting to see if that expands. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, I'll be looking to see, is that, you know, is there any move on that? Because again, it puts the fossil fuels at the centre, and, you know, people were really surprised, ordinary people were really surprised that last year was the first year we made a breakthrough in terms of having an agreement that actually pinpoints fossil fuels and the need to transition away from them. And you're right, it is, you know, it is techie talk, it is jargony, it is full of numbers, it is full of policy statements. What makes COP really useful, though, is that, you know, last year I thought my greatest achievement was getting a page on carbon markets into a mainstream newspaper for mainstream readership. Because when you put carbon markets on a news list for a news editor, they go, what? What brought that alive was being able to talk to not just those who are going to be on the legal side of negotiating and the business side of negotiating carbon markets and carbon deals, but people from areas who feel that their public and commonage lands are potentially going to be used for carbon offsets. So there's a whole, you know, real life discussion there to be had about how are carbon markets going to be organised, just so that they function well, but so that they function justly. Again, loss and damage. You know, there's a lot of talk about operationalisation of the loss and damage fund. You know, what I need to do is talk to people who are in countries at the coalface of climate change who can tell me what loss and damage means to their country. You know, adaptation finance, again, that terminology means very little to the average person, but if I can talk to people, you know, from what it's like to when you are trying to make the changes to adapt to the challenges ahead, and you can't get international finance, and the hoops that you may jump through as a country. It's great for Ireland. We have a good credit rating. We can go to the European Investment Bank, we can go to, we can go to the World Bank, we can go wherever and ask for money, and other countries can, to talk to those who are dealing with that as a daily crisis and trying to make the changes to their country. And again, fossil fuel proliferation, not non-proliferation. It's great to be able to speak to people from African countries who are watching big companies come in from the Chinas and other places, drilling anew, not in any shape or form phasing out or transitioning away, but starting new projects, being able to put that in context and speak to those people. Like that's where you bring the jargon and the policy wonkism, if you like, down to real life and hopefully make an impact on your readers.
Great, thanks very much for that, Caroline. Can I ask the other panelists to rejoin me on the screen here by turning on their videos? We're running very short of time now, and there are lots of questions in the Q&A that we won't get to. Apologies to everyone who contributed questions. I might just pick up on one question, though, around cross-departmental or cross-government attendance at COPs. So Fiona Lawless in the Q&A mentions health ministers attending COP last year because of the Health Day. And can I ask any of the panelists, and this is a chance to give any concluding reflections as well, about what kinds of government officials go to COPs, and do we need to be doing more to bring in officials from across governments around the world?
I could probably start with that, Diarmuid. Yeah, I mean, I think as Caroline said, we're in an unfortunate situation timing-wise this year with the election. I mean, in the last few years, we've actually had a big increase, and John will know this from over the years, in the kind of variety of government ministers that we've had, and it's very strong participation from the Environment Minister, but also Foreign Affairs Ministers and the Taoiseach, and Health and Finance and so on. So it has been really good, and this year obviously it won't be as good, and we know why that is. But I think it's an important thing for us to start pushing again. I will say we've a very good cross-governmental and Department of Environment, as people probably know. They really deserve the credit for the heavy lifting for COP, because they really coordinate the whole national delegation, and we do have we have officials from different departments, even if we don't have ministers from those departments. This year it's pretty good, and we have a sort of an all-year delegation that runs throughout the year that DEC run to kind of coordinate us from the different departments. I mean, the only thing I might add, just a small point on loss and damage, which is that, John, you made a point about targeting and how can we make sure that the right countries get access to the fund. The good news is that through I really think I can hand on my heart say that Ireland had a big role in this, through pretty extensive lobbying from ourselves with small island states. We did manage to get a clause in the loss and damage agreement on a minimum allocation for least developed countries and small island states. It was very hard to get that. We got a lot of pushback from countries who thought that all developing countries should have equal access, but we did get that. And I think now the challenge is that, and this is why it's good that Ireland sits on the board of this fund, we need to make sure that works. We need to make sure that that's operationalized properly. So that'll definitely be a big focus for us at COP. I think I'll leave it at that, Diarmuid, and great to see everybody.
Great, thanks very much, Sinead. John, you look like you want to come in. I might just note that Fiona, who asked the question, has added a clarification in the Q&A saying that she's talking about more a developing country point of view. She's coming from an international development perspective and from the perspective of countries that don't have the resources to send as big a delegation. But John, did you want to come in there?
I think Sinead has said it all in that sense. The framing of the loss and damage agreement is going to be crucial. And to be honest, it's probably going to take a few more years to sort out some of the details as to who pays and who benefits and what are the criteria for a loss and the damage. So I think that's something that we have to face up to. I think it's disappointing that the question that was asked about the political agenda, the lack of representation of ministers, is quite disappointing. I think neither the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach being there doesn't help Ireland's case very much. And it shows a lack of prioritisation, I think, at the end of the day. So I think we have to recognise that the climate issue ebbs and flows over the years, and it's consciously being downplayed now in the forthcoming Irish election that we're facing up to. So one hopes that it's not going to be an ongoing issue, and that we have to keep placing this topic right in front of the politicians over the years to come, in order that their prioritisation may change.
Thanks, John. I don't know, Lucy, do you want to add any closing remarks?
Well, again, just coming at it from a biodiversity perspective, our National Biodiversity Action Plan, which was released in January, speaks to a whole of government, whole of society approach, and we have to take that approach across both the climate and the nature nexus. So, it's really important that we have good representation from government. It affects everybody. It affects the Department of Finance. It affects health. It affects so many different things across government that it's really important that everybody's aware and that it's mainstreamed across government.
Great, thanks very much, Lucy. Caroline, I don't know, are you still with us there, and do you want to add any closing reflections?
Yes, maybe just to say that, look at yes, I think representation by both officials and ministers is hugely important because of the impact it has on them. If they go once in their political career, they'll remember it and they'll talk to their colleagues about it, and it makes an impact on them. And at the moment, most politicians will tell you climate change does not come up at the doorstep, therefore I'm not going to introduce it to the doorstep. It's harder for them personally to push that to the back of their mind if they spend time at COP. That's the impression that I get from talking to those who do attend. So I just think it really is a shame that more aren't attending this year.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Caroline, and apologies again to you for the technical difficulties, but I'm glad we found a way to make it work in the end. We've run slightly over time, and we'll have to wrap things up, but I'm sure you'll all agree that it has been a very rich and informative discussion, and we could no doubt have continued for longer, and apologies to everyone who posed questions in the Q&A that we didn't have time to get to. It just falls to me to wrap things up now. If you'd like to keep in touch with our work at the DCU Centre for Climate and Society, please sign up to our monthly newsletter at www.dcu.ie/climate. You can also follow the Centre at DCU Climate on Twitter or X. And finally, a big thank you to our four panellists: Sinead Walsh, John Sweeney, Caroline O'Doherty, and Lucy Gaffney. And a big thank you also to you, our audience, for joining us this afternoon in such large numbers. Thanks very much and goodbye.